Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Now, what you're about to hear isn't being reported honestly by anyone. Not CNN, not the New York Times, not even the Pentagon in their carefully crafted press releases. In fact, if you've been paying attention, and I mean really paying attention, why, you might have noticed something strange over the last 48 hours. Reports began surfacing on obscure Middle Eastern Telegram channels, a few translated whispers on Reddit, and then a sudden blackout. A literal information vacuum. No footage, no confirmation. But according to sources, and we'll get into exactly who those sources are and why they matter, several of Iran's nuclear research facilities were targeted and possibly destroyed in a coordinated high-altitude B-2 stealth bomber strike led by the United States. You heard that right. A full-scale precision kinetic operation, without a single press conference, without congressional oversight, and without any footage shown to the American public. Now, why would something so monumental, something that could tip the world toward World War III, be hidden behind silence? That's the question we have to ask. Because if you listen to the White House, there is no operation. If you press the Pentagon, they'll say they cannot confirm or deny current force posture in the Persian Gulf. That's not a no. That's not even a maybe. That's a lie couched in bureaucracy. And it begs a far bigger question. Is the U.S. government lying about a direct act of war? Or is this all smoke and mirrors, a manufactured narrative to distract from something else entirely? Maybe the collapsing southern border, maybe inflation, maybe an election year scandal, or maybe something even darker? Let's start with the timeline. On Sunday night, July 29th, around 2:14 a.m., Tehran local time, seismic activity was reported near Natanz, one of Iran's most closely guarded underground nuclear enrichment sites. The Iranian government initially dismissed it as routine construction. But satellite data from independent analysts in Europe, which mysteriously vanished within hours, indicated a series of thermal anomalies in the region, consistent with high-yield precision ordnance strikes. The type of signature typically associated with 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs, the kind only a handful of platforms can even carry. Chief among them, the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit, America's flying ghost. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The B-2 is not just any aircraft, it's the most secretive, most advanced bomber in the world. Radar invisible, near silent, capable of slipping past even the most advanced Russian-made S-400 surface-to-air systems without detection. It was built for one reason: to carry out precision, long-range strikes without anyone knowing until it's too late. The B-2 doesn't ask permission, it doesn't need to, and it rarely flies without a reason. So when air traffic monitoring groups in Turkey and Qatar noticed what they described as transponder silence corridors over the Persian Gulf, meaning radar gaps that suggest stealth aircraft in operation, that set off alarm bells. People who track this stuff for a living began asking questions. Where were those bombers going? Why now? And if it wasn't the B-2, then who? Of course, Iran, true to form, initially denied everything. Then, in a twist we've seen before, they suddenly evacuated over 3,000 personnel from nuclear-linked facilities in Isfahan, Fordow, and Arak. That's not normal. That's not maintenance. That's not routine. That's panic. And that's when the footage started leaking. Just seconds of thermal video showing what appears to be a massive underground detonation, followed by shockwave distortion. The video was pulled within minutes, labeled misinformation, and scrubbed from major platforms. But not before we archived it. We'll show you what we can later in the program. But trust me, someone doesn't want this seen. And if all of this wasn't strange enough, the disappearing footage, the government silence, the mysterious seismic activity in Natanz and Fordow, let's now turn to something even more suspicious: the behavior of the satellites. Within hours of the supposed detonation near Iran's key enrichment sites, thermal imaging from both NASA's MODIS and ESA's Sentinel-2 satellites began exhibiting unexplained gaps in regional data. These aren't amateur skycams. These are multi-billion-dollar platforms that have been observing Earth in minute detail for over a decade, and suddenly, right when the world should be watching Iran's interior like a hawk, the feed goes dark. This isn't a coincidence. This is coordination. Either those agencies were instructed to pull data, or someone with very high-level access scrubbed the thermal images before they reached the public. What are they hiding? What could they be hiding that would require the cooperation of multiple space agencies across different continents? Let's go further. According to air traffic data obtained through ADS-B exchange networks, the same technology used by civilian pilots and aviation enthusiasts worldwide, 2 dark corridors appeared above the Gulf of Oman and western Afghanistan on the night of July 29th. These corridors, which signal radio silence and the absence of transponder feedback, are not a technical glitch. They are a known indicator that stealth aircraft are either entering or leaving sensitive airspace. Now think about that. What aircraft flies without transponder data? What aircraft operates silently at 50,000 feet, carrying massive bunker-busting payloads and isn't tracked by civilian radar? Only one answer fits: the B-2 Spirit. So why is no one talking about it? Why is this aircraft, which costs more per hour to fly than nearly any other on Earth, being used in complete secrecy, unless something very real, very dangerous, and very deliberate just took place? Here's what multiple unnamed but credible sources, some military, some civilian contractors, are telling us. The operation wasn't just a strike, it was a proof of concept, a test not only of America's ability to hit fortified underground targets from a safe distance, but also of its ability to hide such an operation from the public, the press, and even our own allies. The entire operation, from planning to deployment to after-action data suppression, was an exercise in fourth-generation warfare. War not just with bombs and bullets, but with information, with perception, with control. And what's worse, it succeeded. No public debate, no congressional vote, no outrage, just silence. The deep echoing silence of a democracy too distracted to notice it's being turned inside out. But why? Why target Iran now? Why hide the strike instead of celebrating it as a bold act of deterrence or strength? Here's where it gets unsettling. Because this may not be about Iran's nuclear capabilities at all. In fact, according to one former DIA analyst we spoke with, who has chosen to remain anonymous for his safety, Iran's enrichment program has been under crippling cyber and economic attack for years. It posed no immediate threat. But what it did pose was a geopolitical inconvenience. Think about that phrase. Geopolitical inconvenience. It implies something very sinister. That Iran's existence as a defiant, semi-sovereign state standing outside of Western economic influence is the real threat, not a nuclear bomb, but a refusal to comply. That's why Natanz was targeted. That's why Fordow, which is buried 80 meters underground and surrounded by concrete and steel, was included. Because this wasn't about uranium. It was about humiliation. It was about making a point. To Iran, yes. But more importantly, to China, Russia, and every nation watching the slow collapse of the post-war through American hegemony. The message was simple. We can still hit you and you'll never even see it coming. And this is where things take a darker, far more global turn. Because what happened, or may have happened in the Iranian desert last week, isn't just an isolated act of military aggression. It's not just a classified bombing run or another page in America's long and blood-soaked foreign policy playbook. No, this is something else entirely. This is a signal, a stress test, a massive chess piece moved in the open. Not just against Iran, but against a rising, multipolar world that no longer bows to Washington's narrative. And if you're still thinking in terms of red states and blue states, Democrats versus Republicans, then you're missing the bigger picture. Because this isn't just about war. This is about control, monetary control, narrative control, electoral control. It's about using conflict or the illusion of conflict to reset the table, to rewrite the rules. Let's look at the timing. The B-2 bomber event, which may or may not have occurred in the exact way we're being told, assuming we're even being told anything, just happens to coincide with an increasingly volatile American election season. Inflation numbers are climbing again. The Federal Reserve is trapped in a corner, raise rates and crash the economy, lower them and destroy the dollar's purchasing power. The border is a mess. Crime in major cities is spiraling. The approval ratings for the sitting administration are abysmal, and trust in every major institution, from Congress to the CDC to the FBI, is in freefall. So what's the playbook when you're losing control? Historically, it's always the same. You redirect the narrative, you manufacture urgency, and you invoke the one unifying illusion Americans have never fully shaken, the illusion of foreign threat. But this time, it's not about nationalism or oil or even terrorism. It's about monetary supremacy. Let's call it what it really is. The dollar standard is crumbling, and the people running this country, or pretending to, know it. They see China and Russia buying gold at record levels. They see BRICS nations preparing to trade in a new commodity-backed currency. They see global trade agreements quietly shifting away from the petrodollar, and they are terrified. Because if the dollar loses its role as the world's reserve currency, the entire American empire, from our military spending to our welfare state to our imported consumer culture, collapses like a house of cards. So what do you do when the world starts walking away from your currency? You force them to stay. You stir chaos. You initiate regional instability. You make global actors afraid to decouple from the dollar. You create a world where the only perceived safety is under the umbrella of U.S. hegemony, a hegemony that now requires fire, drones, and covert bombing raids to sustain. And make no mistake, the people engineering this are not fools. They are not improvising. They are planning, because they understand something you're not supposed to realize. Narrative is more powerful than reality. If they can convince you that Iran is a nuclear threat, despite having no proof, then you'll accept the need for secret airstrikes. If they can convince global markets that instability in the Middle East requires U.S. military presence, then the dollar holds another day. If they can convince voters that a sitting president is tough on terror, they can shift the momentum of an election cycle. It's not about truth, it's about timing. And this strike, whether real or staged or symbolic, came at the perfect time. And we know it wasn't just about Iran, because look what happened next. Within 36 hours of the alleged strike, senior officials from the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and India all received unannounced calls from the U.S. State Department. No press briefings, no statements, just closed-door phone diplomacy. Why? Because those countries, and especially Saudi Arabia and India, have been quietly drifting out of Washington's orbit. And if this still feels too surreal, if you're sitting there thinking, surely they wouldn't go this far, would they? Then maybe it's time we finally admit something we should have known for years. There is no line they won't cross. Because this alleged B-2 stealth strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, whether real, half-real, or a pure psyop, follows a blueprint that's older than most of our modern institutions. It's not new. It's not even original. In fact, it's among the oldest tricks in the empire's book: the false flag, the manufactured crisis, the pretext for power. To understand what might have just happened, or what is still unfolding as we speak, we have to stop pretending our institutions are immune to the same manipulations we condemn in other nations. We love pointing at history, at Stalin, at Saddam, at the Reichstag fire, at North Korea, and saying, that's what tyranny looks like. But we forget that American history is dripping with its own blood-soaked deceptions. We forget that the idea of faking an attack to justify military intervention is not conspiracy. It's documented strategy. Let's go back. In 1898, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. The U.S. blames Spain. Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain. The war that followed gave America its first taste of overseas empire. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. But decades later, we learned the truth. The Maine wasn't bombed by Spain at all. It was most likely an internal explosion. A tragic accident twisted into war propaganda. Sound familiar? Fast forward to 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. Supposedly, 2 U.S. destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Congress rushed to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, handing President Johnson broad war powers, and the Vietnam War exploded. 58,000 American deaths, over 1 million Vietnamese, napalm, Agent Orange, draft riots. And guess what? The second attack? It never happened. It was invented, a total fabrication that the NSA now admits, in declassified reports, was known to be false at the time. And then, of course, the crown jewel, Iraq, 2003, weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell at the United Nations, waving around fake chemical diagrams. Yellow cake uranium, mobile biolabs. All of it fiction. All of it sold to you as fact. All of it pushed by a complicit media, a frightened public, and a government that knew damn well it was going to war regardless of the truth. And when we discovered the lies, when no WMDs were found, no one was held accountable. Not a single official went to prison. The architects got richer. The critics were blacklisted. The war profiteers made billions, and we moved on. So now ask yourself, if they did it then, what makes you think they wouldn't do it now? Let's look at what we know. We have seismic data suggesting an underground detonation in central Iran, conveniently downplayed as construction activity. We have satellite image gaps during the exact hours those detonations supposedly occurred. We have civilian radar silence consistent with stealth aircraft operation. We have airspace closures over the Gulf of Oman and Afghanistan. We have regional news stories that were published and then deleted. And most damning of all, we have absolute silence from every Western institution that would normally jump to exploit or condemn such an event. Silence that only makes sense if the people in power are either complicit or afraid of what it might trigger. Now consider this. Why would a government so obsessed with narrative control refuse to capitalize on a successful stealth strike against Iran? If this was a real operation and it was victorious, then from a political perspective, it should have been a slam dunk. A headline moment to distract from inflation, crime, and election polling. So why bury it? Why not celebrate it? Because maybe this wasn't about victory at all. And now the mask comes off completely, because if the alleged stealth bombing of Iranian nuclear sites was the match, then what follows is the fire. A quiet, creeping inferno of surveillance, censorship, and state power not just aimed at Tehran, but at you. Because every empire that wages shadow wars abroad inevitably turns those weapons inward, and if you're still watching this thinking the target is somewhere over there, you're already behind. The real battlefield now is domestic. It's the classroom where your kids are taught submission, the smartphone that tracks your location, the social media feed that curates your reality, and the financial system quietly preparing to judge you not by your income but by your compliance. This is the new face of warfare. Not boots on the ground, but bots in your inbox. Not tanks in the streets, but terms of service that erase your opinions. Not generals with medals, but algorithms with kill switches built into every platform you touch. You've heard of central bank digital currencies. They're being pitched as innovation, but they're controlled by another name, programmable dollars that can expire, be frozen or denied based on your social behavior. You've seen the rise of domestic extremism as a new watchword, but you weren't told the definition keeps shifting. And soon, it will include doubting this broadcast, questioning foreign wars, resisting lockdowns, or quoting the Constitution in the wrong tone of voice. You've noticed how every crisis, foreign or domestic, is followed by a sudden push for more surveillance. Drones over cities, facial recognition at airports, new bills passed in the name of safety that no one reads until they're law. You saw it after 9/11 with the Patriot Act, after COVID with vaccine passports and QR code segregation. And now, after Iran, the next phase is being prepared. A permanent state of emergency, not declared openly, but embedded in the code, the culture, the cloud. The same military-industrial complex that flattened Baghdad and buried facts in Fallujah is now in bed with Silicon Valley, and together they are building an invisible cage, one you won't see until you try to leave. And it's all happening in plain sight, under the banner of equity, public health, climate urgency, or now, global instability. They tell you this is for your own good, but somehow, every new security measure leaves you with less freedom and them with more power. They claim the B-2 strike was never confirmed. But they don't want confirmation, they want confusion. Because in confusion, truth becomes relative. And those who ask the wrong questions become enemies of stability. So now the Department of Homeland Security wants access to your encrypted messages, not because you're a criminal, but because you're thinking independently, which, in their eyes, is the most dangerous act of all. Meanwhile, AI systems trained by government contractors monitor speech patterns, facial cues, and search histories, all to build risk profiles on civilians who still believe in privacy, borders, or the Bill of Rights. And while all this happens, the political class distracts you with meaningless scandals, rigged debates, race baiting, gender wars, and the illusion of choice, while both parties sign off on trillion-dollar defense packages and surveillance expansions they claim not to understand. Every bombing abroad now justifies a lockdown at home. Every drone strike paves the way for a drone over your suburb. Every foreign threat is eventually rewritten into a domestic threat. Because in the eyes of the permanent state, the most dangerous thing in America today is not Iran, not China, not Russia. It's a citizen who thinks critically, speaks freely, and refuses to kneel. That's why they don't want you to know what happened in Iran. Because the real operation wasn't just over there, it was here. Right now in your feed, in your silence, in your acceptance. And now we come to the most unsettling possibility of all. That the alleged B-2 stealth bombing of Iran wasn't merely a covert military operation or an act of aggression masked by silence, but rather a calculated ignition point in a far larger, more insidious campaign to manipulate the outcome of the 2024 U.S. election and permanently reshape the American political system from within, using global instability as a pretext to rewrite the rules of democracy itself. Because what if, and let's be honest here, what if the real target of the operation wasn't Iran's nuclear centrifuges or its uranium stockpiles or its air defense network, but rather the American public's last shred of institutional trust? What if this whole sequence, the denied airstrike, the vanishing satellite data, the coordinated media blackout, is just a test, a dry run, a digital litmus test for how much reality the government can alter without your consent, because the greatest weapon the state has ever discovered isn't bombs or drones or tanks. It's psychological warfare. It's narrative control. And in 2024, whoever owns the narrative owns the election, the economy, and the future. And that narrative is being shaped not by voters but by intelligence agencies, defense contractors, big tech monopolies, foreign influencers, and media corporations that masquerade as watchdogs while secretly serving as enforcers for the regime's preferred script. Because right now, as we speak, while Americans argue over student loans and social media policies and celebrity scandals, a much darker agenda is moving beneath the surface. An agenda to create so much manufactured chaos, both foreign and domestic, that the population willingly embraces authoritarian solutions under the banner of safety and order. And we've seen this play before: problem, reaction, solution. First you drop a crisis, then you let the people panic, then you offer the fix. Except this time the fix is surveillance, censorship, behavioral compliance, and the slow, deliberate merging of military infrastructure with domestic governance, and it's happening with surgical precision. Because what did we hear immediately after the alleged Iran strike? Not confirmation, not denial, not transparency, but silence. Cold, coordinated silence. The kind of silence that only happens when multiple institutions are told, in no uncertain terms, to stand down and hold the line. Because if the story gets out, if the public realizes the U.S. just launched an undeclared act of war during an election cycle, it would unravel everything, not just geopolitically but domestically. Because Americans would start asking the one question no regime wants to hear: who gave the order and why? And that's the question that leads us to the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about Iran. It was about shaping the conditions for a 2024 election that feels less like a civic exercise and more like a national lockdown. Because look around. The FBI has already ramped up warnings of election extremism. Big tech is tightening its grip on political speech. State-level cybersecurity drills are being framed as domestic war games. And every institution from DHS to the NSA is preparing for digital threats that, coincidentally, always come from dissenting voices, alternative media, independent journalists, and regular Americans who simply want a fair election. And while the regime tells you to fear foreign bots and hostile cyber actors, the real algorithmic warfare is being aimed at you through AI-moderated content suppression, search engine bias, shadow bans, narrative framing, and content fact-checking by groups funded by the very people running the war machine. And they know the stakes. They know that if the American public wakes up, if they connect the dots between foreign chaos and domestic manipulation, if they realize their votes are being filtered through a system designed to absorb outrage and convert it into compliance,